Joe Biden sat behind the resolute desk, delivering his final address with the gravitas of a man who knows the weight of history but seems reluctant to acknowledge his place in it. The words that flowed from his mouth were laced with regret, a eulogy for a democracy teetering on the brink, hollowed out by wealth, manipulated by the powerful, and ignored by those who once swore to defend it. An oligarchy is taking shape in America, he declared, painting a picture of an unstoppable tide of money and influence, drowning out the voices of everyday Americans. But the real tragedy? This wasn't a revelation, it was a confession. For years, Democrats, Biden included, have enabled the very forces he warned against. Their reluctance to challenge corporate interests head on, their willingness to compromise principles for campaign cash, and their addiction to the status quo that it rewards the rich and punishes the poor. These are the quiet betrayals that led us here. Biden's address could have been a rallying cry, but instead it felt like an overdue admission that the party of the people had long since swapped their work boots for Gucci loafers. Throughout his speech, Biden invoked grand imagery. The Statue of Liberty swaying but never falling, the resilience of the American spirit, the shining promise of a fair shot. But what good is poetic rhetoric when the reality is far grimmer? The working class doesn't need metaphors. We need relief. We need the jobs Biden promised wouldn't be shipped overseas, the healthcare that wouldn't bankrupt us, and the fair wages that would actually reflect the value of our labor. We needed a party that fought for us, not just in speeches, but in policy. And that's where the Democrats failed spectacularly. Biden claimed his administration had created nearly 17 million new jobs, a statement that conveniently glosses over the reality that many of those jobs don't pay wages that can keep up with inflation. He touted infrastructure improvements, broadband expansion, and semiconductor manufacturing. Yet the same corporations benefiting from these initiatives are the ones funneling billions into the pockets of executives and shareholders while squeezing the workers dry. His words about fairness and dignity rang hollow against the backdrop of his party's consistent failure to rein in corporate excess. And then came his warning about the tech industrial complex, an eerily familiar phrase borrowed from Eisenhower's caution about the military industrial complex. Biden expressed concerns about the concentration of technological power in the hands of a few, about misinformation and AI's potential to reshape society in ways we can't yet predict. But where was this urgency when his party had the chance to regulate big tech? Where was the crackdown when corporations like Amazon and Google crushed union efforts and devoured competitors with impunity? Instead, Democratic leadership, eager for Silicon Valley's donations, sat on their thumbs and smiled through campaign fundraisers. Biden's farewell address was not just an indictment of the dangers posed by oligarchies. It was an inadvertent indictment of his own party's spinelessness. We need to get dark money out of politics, he proclaimed, as though he hadn't watched his own party rake in millions from undisclosed sources in past elections. Super PACs, lobbying firms, and billionaire backed think tanks have had their fingers in the Democratic pie for decades, crafting policies that serve their interests while leaving working Americans with scraps. Perhaps the most biting moment of Biden's address was his call to make the wealthy play by the same rules as everyone else. A noble sentiment, but one that begs the question: who's been enforcing those rules, Joe? The tax loopholes remain wide open, corporate tax rates remain laughably low, Wall Street continues to operate with impunity while the working class gets lectured about fiscal responsibility. Democrats have had ample opportunity to rewrite the rules, to level the playing field, yet time and time again, they've hesitated, compromised, or simply turned a blind eye. You can't say you had no control, Joe. And let's not forget Biden's parting shot. We must ensure no president is above the law. A thinly veiled jab at Trump, but an ironic statement from a man whose party has failed to hold the GOP or its own accountable. You could have pushed for a prosecution, Joe, but did you? When Democrats had the chance to push for meaningful reforms, whether it was reining in the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington, cracking down on corporate lobbying, or enforcing stricter ethics rules, they balked. Instead, they handed out committee seats to millionaires, turned a blind eye to insider trading, and continued to play the game as it was, not as it should be. The speech might have served as Biden's last act of public service, but it was too little, too late. His warnings about rising inequality and the erosion of democratic norms were spot on, but they came from a man and a party that have too often failed to act when it mattered most. The Democrats, once the supposed vanguard of progressivism, have instead become enablers of the very system they claim to fight. Their failure to address systemic corruption and economic inequality has created fertile ground for right wing faux populists like Trump to thrive. In the end, Biden's farewell was a missed opportunity. An opportunity to name names, to admit fault, and to call for real, tangible change, rather than another round of lofty platitudes. Instead, it served as a bookend to a presidency that, while not without its achievements, ultimately fell short of delivering the structural change America desperately needs. If Democrats want to avoid the same fate in the future, they have to do more than just warn against oligarchy. Aristotle did that, and he did a better job of it. Democrats must actively dismantle it. They must break their addiction to corporate money, embrace bold policies that put workers first, and most importantly, prove through action, not words, that they are still the party of the people. Otherwise, Biden's farewell address will be remembered not as a rallying cry, but as an elegy for a party that lost its way.